Thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me? I got my coffee and my water. I'm going to do my best not to spill it on the computer. Between 1827 and 1837, approximately 23,000 Creek Indians moved from Alabama to what is now Oklahoma. All right. And before I get into that story and how it happened, first let's talk about what removal actually was. In my book, I give it away. Removal is a form of ethnic cleansing, all right? And ethnic cleansing is a term that is kind of emerged in the 1990s with the breakup of Yugoslavia. But historians of ethnic cleansing have gone back through history and have seen the term cleansing, not necessarily ethnic cleansing, what did I do? But cleansing throughout history. And basically what ethnic cleansing is any attempt to purge a people, a race, a culture, a religion from a land in order to secure that land for the other people, all right? And this is precisely what the federal and state governments, federal government and the state government of Alabama did to the Creek Indians, all right? They wanted every single last Creek Indian out of the state. And in fact, they didn't care who you were, how much money you had, or your background. They removed the first wave, which we'll talk about, of people that moved in the 1820s were unimaginably wealthy for people in the Southeast. Just entrepreneurs, people who ran taverns, owned slaves, ran inns, and they were forced to move, okay? A Baptist missionary, a Creek Indian who became a Baptist missionary and was engaged in trying to convert other Creek Indians and other Southeastern Indians, he was also compelled to move. The government even targeted white husbands of Creek Indians. They're called Indian countrymen. And they thought that if we can get these white husbands to go to Oklahoma, their wives will follow, and therefore their kids will follow, their cousins will follow, the clan will follow. And this will break up the Creek Nation, and we can easily move them west, all right? So it really didn't matter who you were. Allies of the federal government, people who had fought on the side of the federal government, Creek Indians who had fought on the side of the federal government, were also compelled to move, all right? And so really, the government was trying to create a white settlement in Alabama and Georgia, right, by moving Creek Indians out, all right? And so the story begins in 1825 when James Monroe sent two commissioners down to Alabama and Georgia to try to negotiate a treaty with the Creek Indians. And one thing I want you to understand is that what happened to the Creeks is also happening throughout the eastern part of the United States. The Creek experience, when it comes to dealing with federal and state officials, is really not an outlier. This is absolutely sort of standard practice. The federal and state governments had sort of a bag of tricks that they used, and they would use these bag of tricks throughout, whether this is, Potawatomis in Wisconsin and Michigan, whether it's Cherokees in North Carolina and Tennessee, Chickasaws in Mississippi and Alabama, Creek Indians in Alabama and Georgia. They use these bag of tricks to try to dislodge the native peoples from their ancestral homeland. So two commissioners come down to Alabama, and they're specifically looking for one person, and that's William McIntosh. I'm hitting the wrong button. I apologize. Right there. They're looking for this guy right here, William McIntosh. William McIntosh is the son of a Scotsman and a Creek Indian woman, all right? He is very, very wealthy, extremely wealthy. He's aided the federal government in the First Creek War and in the First Seminole War, all right? He owns a tavern in Georgia. He owns a plantation on the Chattahoochee River. He owns slaves. He owns thousands of head of livestock. He owns multiple homes. He has multiple wives. He has a huge part of a huge clan. And this guy he has done it in the past, but he is willing to sell out his people and cede land illegally to the federal government in exchange for bribes. And in 1825, William McIntosh, who is the fifth-ranking member of the National Council, this is the Creek governing body, signs the Treaty of Indian Springs in what is now Georgia, or what was then Georgia, and cedes all of the land of Georgia and a big swath of land in Alabama to the federal government in exchange for equal parts land in what is now Oklahoma. And this is one of the bag of tricks that the federal government used. Land swap treaties, saying, look, you're not giving up any land, you're just giving up this land. You get equal amount of land in the West. They talk up how beautiful Oklahoma is, how bountiful Oklahoma is, how they'll be much more successful if they just move to Oklahoma. All right? William McIntosh, now everybody in the Creek National Council opposes this. There was a death penalty attached to any Creek person who ceded land without the approval of all the headmen. He is the only legitimate headman who signs this treaty. 49 other people are his family members, hangers-on, colleagues, cronies, you name it. And they signed this treaty, and all this land is now gone, okay? And so this is the bag of tricks that the federal government did. They identified one Indian who would be willing to cede land. And once you get that signature, the federal government uses that and tells the rest of the nation who opposed it, look, it doesn't matter. You signed this treaty. One of your headmen signed this treaty. And this will happen throughout, where you get these kind of rogue headmen who will sign treaties illegally, and that will be the binding treaty for the entire nation. 49/50ths, one of the investigators discovered, opposed this treaty of the Creek Nation. 49/50ths. And yet the federal government is going to enforce this treaty, all right? Now, because there was a death penalty attached to this, William McIntosh, 2 months later, is executed. He's surrounded by 150 warriors. They set fire to his plantation in the middle of the night on the Chattahoochee River. He emerges in the doorway with a shotgun. They begin shooting him. He runs out. He's shot in the yard. And then after he's dead, they continue pumping musket balls into his body. 100 and some balls after he had died. They were incredibly outraged at what he had done. All right? The Creek Indians then go on a very, very effective and concerted resistance movement to try to get this nullified, all right? And they go to Washington, and they constantly petition federal officials. And I'm not going to get into the negotiations, but in January of 1826, so the Treaty of Indian Springs was signed in February of 1825, just under a year later, January of 1826, the Creek Indians were able to get the Treaty of Indian Springs nullified. The federal government actually believed that this was a fraudulent treaty. They sent investigators down to try to investigate whether it was. These investigators were charged with basically upholding the treaty, and the Creeks convinced them, wow, this is fraudulent, okay? This is the only Indian treaty in American history that was overturned after it had been confirmed by the Senate and ratified by the President of the United States. The only Indian treaty in U.S. history. So that's how effective the Creeks were in getting this fraudulent treaty overturned. But the treaty was sort of a win-lose, because they didn't get their Georgia land back in this new treaty, but they did get their Alabama land back. So all the Creeks now are forced across the Chattahoochee River into Alabama on what was remaining of about 5 million acres of land. So 23, maybe 24,000 Creek Indians on a piece of land. Now here's the thing about these treaties that are so effective, and it's part of the bag of tricks that the federal government has. The goal of this treaty, so the Treaty of Indian Springs did not cede all of the Creek land to the federal government. It ceded a lot of Creek land to the federal government, but not all of it. They knew that no Creek Indian would sign everything away. Even William McIntosh probably wouldn't do that. But what this treaty was effective at doing was forcing a lot of people onto a small, unmanageable parcel of land. All their hunting land in Georgia was taken away, right? And so now you have 23,000 people on 5 million acres, which sounds like not that big a deal because we live in cities that are hundreds of thousands of people, but they needed hunting land to feed themselves, right? And they didn't all want to live in these compact settlements. And so what happens is these treaties make life much more difficult for the Creek Indians because they don't have as much hunting land. Starvation kicks in very, very rapidly after 1826. And whenever the Creek Indians complain to state officials or federal officials, they say, look, we can't live like this, we're starving, etc. What does the federal government say? Oklahoma. It's Indian territory, but I'll just call it Oklahoma. You can go to Oklahoma. You can immigrate, and you still have 8-9 million acres of land in Oklahoma that you can settle to. And so this is the first phase of Creek Indian removal. It's the immigration era. And it's when the Creek Indians, in quotes, voluntarily move to Oklahoma. Some of them go eagerly. Some of them are convinced that Oklahoma is the land of bounty, that they're going to go and become wealthy, okay? Some go because they think removal is inevitable and that all the Creek Indians are going to have to go at some point, and we better get there quick and get a piece of land. In one heartbreaking letter, one Creek family is writing to Andrew Jackson, President Andrew Jackson, in 1829-30, and says, we're not going for us, we're going for our children. They love to hunt. We have no hunting here in Alabama. You say there's hunting in Oklahoma. All right? And so they go. About 3,500 people go. The first detachment of Creek immigrants leave in November of 1827. And they're led by the way, so William McIntosh is executed. He's the leader of the McIntosh faction of about 800 people that support him and are willing to move to Indian Territory, Oklahoma. His brother, Rowley, takes over after William McIntosh dies, all right? The first detachment leaves in November of 1827, led by Chili McIntosh, who is William McIntosh's son and nephew to Rowley McIntosh. Okay, so Chili McIntosh leads about 700 Creek Indians, about 86 slaves, and they leave. And I got a map here, which I guess I could use this. So you see they have little camps. What they'll do is they'll have camps in various places. And these are basically camps where you meet, you put your stuff into a wagon, and you just wait until the designated time. And then they move to what's called the Rendezvous, and they move up here. And the Rendezvous in 1827 was a town called Harpersville. So if you drive on 280 and you head to Birmingham, you'll hit Harpersville, right? And they meet here. And this is where the federal agents, and these agents are usually military officers. In this case, it's a colonel in the U.S. Army, meets every Creek Indian, takes notes of how many family members are there, et cetera, et cetera. They consolidate all those wagons into, smaller or bigger wagons, and they march out, right? And they go by land. And this is the typical route. They'll head up here to, just under the Tennessee River here. And because the roads at this time are so terrible between Memphis and Tuscumbia, the women, children, and elderly will take boats, and they'll go up here. And the men will walk with their horses and wagons to Memphis. They'll meet. This area right here, the St. Francis River area right here, is just inundated with water. It's called the Mississippi Swamp. So what you have is again, women and children going down by water. The men have to brave it because you can't put those horses onto the steamboats. Oftentimes the wagons are too big to put on steamboats. And so they'll march through this swamp here. And descriptions during this time call it swimming and wading. They weren't actually walking. They were basically waist deep in water during much of this time. And then they come down, and this is the route they follow. In my research, one of the big questions that I had, especially when you have to do a map and you have to make a line, is whether they crossed here at Dardanelle on the north side or the south side. And these are two major roads, and it just depends sort of on what the condition of the roads are. And I had the darndest time sometimes determining whether they crossed the river or not, which normally wouldn't matter, but you have to make a map, right? So you have to kind of... And they ended up here at Cantonment Gibson, or Fort Gibson, which is where all these southeastern Indians ended up there. It's a kind of a rundown, soldiers hated it, it's out in the middle of nowhere, and this is sort of the garrison that would protect the Indians from Western Indians. And here's another thing about Indian removal that you got to pay attention to. These Indians being forced or coerced west are moving here, and they're settling on land of other Indians who were forced to give up their land. So these Indians are now intruders on other Indians' land. So when you think about removal, there's two sets of victims here. There are Indians from the east who are now displacing Indians in the west. And in this case, the Indians that are being displaced are the Osages. And in 1825, the Osage Indians are coerced into a treaty to give up a big swath of Arkansas and Oklahoma, and they're forced up here into northern Oklahoma and parts of Kansas, all right? And the Osage don't like it. And the Osage will raid the Creek Indians. They'll steal their horses and they'll steal their livestock. And why are they doing this? They're doing this because they see the Creek Indians as intruders on their land, right? So removal just has a lot of layers of victims. In 1828, a year later, another group of voluntary immigrants go, and they leave, they have Fort Bainbridge, but they go up here to Fort Strother, which is an old Creek War site, and they come up here, and then they take boats. Some women and children take boats down the Tennessee River a little bit earlier, but the route is more or less the same. The difference between the 1827 and the 1828 movement is that the 1827 movement, it rained just about every day. Rain or hail. It just was a miserable, miserable journey. And in fact, the 1827, they talked about that there's a train of about 90 miles. So when Creeks were at Fort Smith or even Fort Gibson, some of them had not even gone to Dardanelle yet. So the Creeks were just strewn throughout this here, about 90 miles distance between the front and the back of the train of these immigrants. Now, in 1828, it's dry, it's hot, and the people walking, actually they do it really quickly. It takes them 54 days. But the water party, they're constantly delayed because of low water. Sandbars, they run aground, all this stuff, right? And so these are their movements right here. And I have one more. I'm not going to show you all of, well, I'll show you a couple more here. I won't show you all of them, but this is the 3rd detachment that leaves. Now here, what's interesting about the 3rd detachment, the first 2 voluntary immigrating parties are friends, followers, and relatives of William McIntosh. Most of them are, a vast majority of them. They're people who are not necessarily, they're going on their own recognizance. They're not eager necessarily to go, but they're not dreading it. To them, this is what their leader, William McIntosh, signed up for, and they're game for this. They want to go. In 1829, about 1,300 Creek, and again, just 700 for the first group, about 500 for the second group. In 1829, 1,300 Creek Indians sign up to immigrate, right? So this is more than the first 2 immigrations combined. None of these people are related to William McIntosh, which tells you what? The government's plan of making life really, really crummy in Alabama is starting to kick in. 3 years after that treaty was nullified, that second treaty was signed. Now you have 1,300 people who are saying, I can't stay here. We're starving. We don't have land anymore. A lot of these Creeks that were in Georgia who were forced out after the Treaty of Indian Springs and Treaty of Washington, a lot of them go into Alabama. They don't find land. A lot of this land is hunting land and towns, and it's already been sort of claimed by Upper Creeks. And they move in here and they don't have land. They can't find land, so they're transient. And so a lot of them say, look, I can either wander around here in Alabama or I can take my chance in Oklahoma. And a lot of them do. 1,300 do. This one doesn't have a journal and doesn't have any letters, so I use all receipts from the National Archives to figure out what towns they go in, because every time they hit a town like Gunter's Landing, they rent flatboats. There's a receipt that says 9 flatboats were rented. All right, so that's how I know. They come here, they go through here. One interesting thing about this is that they put all their, in Memphis, they chartered the steamboat Virginia. They put all their stuff in there, and then the steamboat runs aground right near Pine Bluff, Arkansas. And what happens? They have to unload all their stuff. They dump it by the side of the river, and then flatboats come that draft less water, came and picked them all up. Well, what happens to their property? It rots on the, and so I have a list of property that was destroyed. So it's interesting. Feather beds they were taking with them, a lot of silverware, pewter silverware, a lot of clothes, stuff like that you would imagine that they're going to take with them, all rotted, and they're asking for the government to compensate them. All right. This was a terrible emigration. This was the first emigration where you're going to have mass casualties. And by mass, I don't know how many. They say in a letter that there are many deaths. They don't give a number. The first 2 immigrations, I only have one evidence of one person dying. And that person died, I think, in the camp before they even left Alabama. May have been an elderly person who was already sick. But in this case, you're going to have a number of deaths on the way. And I found receipts for people who are digging graves and building coffins. So they're doing this as they go. They're chopping down trees and they're buying wood. And this area is pretty sparsely inhabited, so they're probably making coffins from scratch, right? And they're doing this as they go through here, okay? Okay, so these are the first 3 voluntary emigrations that happen. I mentioned that life is getting increasingly difficult in Alabama because of these trees, because a lot of people are being forced into a small area of land, all right? The Creeks who refuse to go, don't want these Creeks leaving. They're afraid that if a lot of people begin immigrating voluntarily, that it will break the Creek Nation. They have strength in numbers and they refuse to move. And if they start slowly trickling over to Indian territory, what's going to happen? They're going to lose all their strength in numbers. So the Creeks who oppose any form of moving to Indian territory engage in a concerted resistance movement. And they do this in a number of ways. In some cases, they'll go to a place like Sylacauga and they'll threaten the immigrants who are encamped there, threaten them with their lives. Sometimes they threaten them and say, look, we're not going to kill you, but you're going to die on the way. We hear stories that the first 2 immigrations haven't even gotten to Oklahoma yet. They're dead. They die somewhere in Arkansas. Okay? We've heard they'll say that the Indian Territory is a graveyard. They use that term, graveyard. Okay? Because it's so cold there. It's much colder there in the winter than it is in Alabama. So they use bodily threats. They do kill some people. They beat some people to death who refuse to leave. Mostly these Creeks get scared and leave anyway. So in some cases, this third immigration might have been even larger had they not been driven from these enrollment camps. At Sylacauga, there was a big government storehouse where the Creeks, oh, by the way, another bag of tricks for the government is bribery. Any Creek Indian who signs up to immigrate gets a blanket, a kettle, a rifle, traps, and various other things. So they're saying, hey, look, sign up and you get all this free stuff, right? So a lot of Creeks would sign up and do that because they wanted the stuff. And okay, I'm leaving anyway, so they'll go. So they built this government storehouse in Sylacauga where they're going to store all that stuff so that they could distribute it. Well, the Creeks come in and they burn it to the ground, destroying all the stuff inside, right? So the Creeks, again, very concerted effort. And it's somewhat effective, all right? Probably many more would leave than actually left, okay? Now, another way that the Creeks are engaging in trying to prevent immigration is that they're constantly going to Washington, D.C., demanding, and I guess I haven't mentioned too, another insidious thing about these treaties that give up these land swap treaties is that it erodes the buffer between Creeks and white people, right? So if you think about the Creek Nation prior to 1825, it stretches here from the Coosa River to the Flint River here in Georgia. And if you look at maps of Georgia, no white people really lived to the west of the Flint River, right? Mostly in Savannah and Milledgeville and some places in central Georgia. Very few lived in the western part of Georgia, okay? Now, the highest concentration of Creeks were right here on the Chattahoochee River and right here near Montgomery, all right? So if you were a trader or a white person and you wanted to go into the Creek Nation, you had to travel for days over very, very, very dangerous roads. And the roads were very dangerous. We don't think about it because you're on a buggy going real slow. But they would constantly overturn in rivers. There's books about how dangerous these travels were. So a lot of whites didn't come into the Creek Nation. Once they lose all their Georgia land, one of the first things that happens, Columbus, Georgia gets platted. Okay, 1826, 1827, Columbus. Now Columbus becomes a jumping off point into the Creek Nation. Now you have a whole bunch of traders, scoundrels who want to cheat the Creeks, speculators, you name it, now in Columbus. And if you read early accounts of Columbus, it's just the boom town. I mean, they talk about how fast it's growing overnight. People are coming into Columbus and they're really there for one thing, trade with the Indians. Now, these traders caused a lot of problems. A lot of times they would come in and instead of just staying in Columbus, they would come in and settle in the Creek Nation. And they were now squatters. And the Creeks hated these people, couldn't stand them. And they constantly told Washington, D.C., these people are invading our land. The Creek agent did a kind of, I don't know how informal this survey was. There are 23,000 Creeks in Alabama. A little less now that you have immigration, so we'll say about 21,500 maybe. He estimated that there are 25,000 whites living illegally in the Creek Nation. So there were more white people living in the Creek Nation than there were Creek Indians themselves. And one of the things that they're bringing with them is alcohol. They're trading alcohol. And they establish, and this guy in the same letter where he estimates there were 25,000 whites living in the Creek Nation, he estimated that there were 400 grog shops, 400 alcohol shops in the Creek Nation. Okay, so things are getting really, really bad. And the term starvation, the word starvation is being used a lot. Not hunger, not their suffering, but actual people dying of starvation. So the Creeks make a number of trips, 3 at least in the early 1830s to Washington, D.C., demanding that the government come in and try to get rid of these settlers, okay? The government does try to get rid of the settlers, kind of a half-hearted effort, if you will. It happens around the time of the nullification crisis, and so what happens is you have people now saying, if the government comes in and tries to get rid of the Creeks, then we're going to come in. They had South Carolinians and Georgians who were going to come here to try to defy the federal government, right? So you have a lot of problems going on here in Alabama. Here's another bag of tricks that the state did between 1827 and 1830. They passed what are called extension laws. Now, under the Constitution, only the federal government can deal with Indians, but in Alabama, in Mississippi, and in Georgia, between 1827 and 1830, state legislatures passed laws extending state jurisdiction over the Creek Indians, okay, which they couldn't do. So now they have people coming in saying, I can settle here because this is part of Alabama now. It's no longer the Creek Nation, it's Alabama. So these extension laws, and again, they weren't enforced very much, but they terrorized the Creeks. Just having this uncertainty about what jurisdiction, do the chiefs make the laws now, or does Alabama make our laws? We don't know what to do, right? So they go to Washington, D.C. tons of times, 3 times minimum, maybe 4. And they're pleading with either Jackson, they plead with congressmen to try to do something to make their lives better. And each time, what do they say? Go west. That's where you're going to not be disturbed by Georgians or Alabamians. Go west, okay? Now, in 1832, the federal government signs a treaty with the Creek Indians, and this is another bag of tricks, right? So if you're counting the bag of tricks, right? Land swap treaties would be a bag of tricks. Extension laws are another bag of tricks. Here's another bag of tricks. This is how the government approached. They changed tactics. They realized they would never get rid of the Creeks. The Creeks would constantly be going back and forth to Washington, D.C., and they realized that the National Council would never cede land to the federal government again, right? William McIntosh was executed for doing this. They're never going to do it again. So how do you circumvent the National Council? How do you circumvent opposition among the chiefs to ceding land? Well, in 1832, the Creek Indians signed a treaty that, and it's not as complicated as it sounds, and I hope I'm articulate enough to explain it. What the Creeks did is they said to the Creeks, look, this is the only way you're going to be protected is this. If you cede all of the remainder of your land to the federal government, in exchange, we will give you individual land sections, land reserves. Those land reserves will be under the jurisdiction of Alabama and the federal government. You will have a title, a deed, whatever, with your name on it, with your signature on it, your X mark on it, and that will be the law of the land. Nobody can come and take your land if you got that piece of paper saying, this is my land. Creeks had no experience with this, right? But they agree to do it because they realize saying that we've been here long before you is not working, right? White people don't respect that, right? But maybe if we had a title or a deed, they would respect it. So they begrudgingly agreed to cede all the remainder of their land. They now became legitimately under state and federal laws in exchange for individual land reserves. This was a terrible treaty, and the guy that was sort of negotiating with the Creeks, because the Creeks, again, a lot of them don't speak English, so the guy that was with them was a Georgia planter who was also a land speculator. And I don't know if he had good faith and he did the best he could, or if he was like, hey, this is where we can really get it. But they didn't do a very good job for the Creeks. The Creeks had 5 million acres of land right here between the Chattahoochee and the Coosa. And what happened is they gave every head of family 1/2 section of land, which is 320 acres of land, or a piece of land that is 1 mile by 1/2 mile. Okay, 1/2 mile by 1 mile. Chiefs got 640 acres of land, or 1 mile by 1 mile of land square. Okay? Instead of giving every Creek Indian a piece of land, they only gave head of families. So typically it was the male head of family, even though it's a matrilineal society, it should be given to the woman. 6,500 reserves were given. So this is 5 million acres of land. 6,500 acres times 320 plus the 640 only comes out to 2.1 million. So the Creeks essentially ceded 2.9 million acres of their land to the federal government, which was now open for auction, for settlement, and you had now 2.1 million acres which were claimed by the Creek families, okay? Now here's where it's the genius, if you will, in sort of a macabre way of thinking about this. The genius of this is this. The government no longer had to go to the Creek National Council to get land. Who did they go to? They went to 6,500 individual landowners and said, hey, look, your land's great. I want to buy it from you. Okay, they'll sell it. And what you're going to see is a massive, massive fraud land grab in Alabama. And this is in 1832, and this happens in Michigan, and it happens in Wisconsin, and it happens in, and actually this treaty is based on the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, which was signed by the Choctaws about a year and a half earlier. So again, the Creeks are no outliers. This is what's happening throughout the eastern part of the United States. So I'll give you an example of some of the frauds that happen. Okay, some of them are pretty obvious, right? You sell alcohol to a Creek Indian and get them drunk. And then when they're intoxicated, you sign their land away, right? They'll sign, okay, sure, sign it, you got the land. In some cases, they would use impersonation. So in an era before photo IDs, right, you just take the word of the person. So you're a land speculator. The guy who you want, who owns the land won't sell it. He wants to raise his family there. So you find another Creek Indian who's typically on the verge of starvation. You find the ones that are just desperate enough to stab their countrymen in the back. Find that guy, and what they'll do is they'll brief them on all the things that, because the government agent who is going to sign over the land, he's going to have some proof, right? Like, what town are you from? Coweta. Where's the townhouse? It's by the such and such creek. What is the chief? Give me the town Mikos, and you list them all off, okay? And they'll give you a couple questions, and then once you're satisfied, what'll happen is you'll sell the land, right? And of course, if I'm the speculator, there's no way I'm paying full price for that land. So I pay, or maybe I do. Let's just say I'm going to be legitimate and I pay full price for the land to that fake Indian impersonator. And then after the agent leaves, I get all but usually 10 or 15 bucks back. Usually it's about a $5 to $10 to $15 bribe that the impersonator gets. And I bought a piece of land for 15 bucks. That may be worth $1,000, $1,200 bucks. Up to $2,000, okay? There are threats. You go in and say, you better sell me this land or I'm going to kill you, right? That happened a lot. Some of the more heartbreaking ones are, as these frauds are sort of, in 1834, 35 is the height of the frauds. You come in and you say, hey, look, I'm a lawyer. These frauds are terrible. I want to represent you and protect you from fraud. Sign this. I'll represent you, but this is a contract for me to represent you. What are they signing away? Their land. Okay? And then there's bizarre ones. There's a chief, a very powerful chief of Tuckabatchee, who sells his land for $1,000. And after the sale goes through, the guy who bought the land gave him the money. And after that, he wanted to hug the chief. And they gave him a hug. And while he gave him a hug, he reached into the satchel and pulled out the money that he had just turned over, right? So just unimaginable types of fraud that was happening here. So this treaty, it's just the Treaty of Washington, 1832, makes this situation infinitely worse, okay? The government now goes in and they try to get more Creeks to, quote, voluntarily emigrate. In 1834, there's another immigration that happens. This one's interesting only because this is probably the most miserable journey of all of them. The government now sees that a lot of Indians are turning over their land, either through fraud or through legitimate sale. The government now thinks that they're going to get a group of 5,000 Creeks to voluntarily emigrate. So they hire a former Alabama senator by the name of Alexander Hill to come in and recruit as many Indians as possible. And they tell Hill, look, You cannot leave Alabama until you have a minimum of 2,000 people. Remember, only 1,300, that was the largest group we've had so far, but 2,000 people. So he starts recruiting Indians in the spring of 1834, but a lot of Indians don't want to leave. Even the starving ones, even the ones who have lost their land through fraud, do not want to leave the land of their ancestors. They love Alabama. They do not want to go. So Hill has a lot of trouble recruiting 2,000 people. In fact, he only gets about 550. But he can't leave until he's got 2,000. So now you have summer. Now you have late summer, fall. Now you have winter. Finally, he says, look, I only have 550. I can't get any more. And everybody's saying, postpone it until next year. You can't leave in the wintertime. Hill, who's not very good at his job, decides to leave anyway with about 550 Creek Indians. And they rendezvous at Centerville, which is where he was from, so they go there, and they head, and this is, again, I mentioned this for a couple reasons. One, because it was a miserable journey with terrible weather, but also because this is a little bit of an alteration in the route. Instead of going up to the Tennessee, they're going to hit Tuscaloosa, and then they're going to hit Mississippi, okay? It rains, hails, or snows on every single day of this journey, and they leave when it's freezing temperatures, even in Alabama. It's a particularly cold winter. They leave in mid-December. They come up here, and by the time they get here, they're just realizing that this is terrible. The journey, he sends ahead for fires to be built along the path, and every few miles they stop, get the children out, and put them by a fire. Okay? They take blankets, and they have to constantly wrap the kids in blankets. And then once the blanket gets wet and dirty, they have to bring out another blanket. It's constant stopping to warm the kids. They talk about continual crying. You can hear the kids screaming and crying because it's cold. They get up here to Memphis, and they charter a steamboat because they this whole area right here is all frozen over, this inundated land. The steamboat goes down. It constantly has to stop because there's literally frozen sections of the Mississippi River. They get down here into the Arkansas River, and the Arkansas River, about 5 miles out from Little Rock, is completely frozen over. The steamboat can't get in there. So what they do is they get off the boat, they cut down trees, hoping the impact will break up the ice. They ram the steamboat into the ice, hoping to act as an icebreaker to break it up. They finally manage to get to Little Rock, but they can't go any further because the Arkansas is completely frozen over all the way up. This area, for the men who are taking the horses and the wagons, this is pretty bad as well. Horses, right? On ice, they're not very graceful, right? So they actually have to tie rope around the horse's legs and drag them over the ice because it's completely frozen over. They end up here, and then, by the way, Arkansas is being hit with an influenza epidemic. They head there. Unfortunately, we don't have any evidence of how many actually died. He doesn't tell us. He lists 5 in the muster roll dying, but I suspect there's probably more. They finally get to Fort Gibson after that. There's one more immigration in 1835, and then in 1836, the Creeks start a war, and this is the Second Creek War. And this is the largest resistance movement right here in the removal area. The frauds, the loss of land, the starvation. The Creeks, a group of Creeks down here along the Chattahoochee River are fed up. And they begin going from plantation to plantation in May of 1836, killing the owner, burning the houses down. And you have the Second Creek War. And I'm not going to get into the Second Creek War. There's a great book on the Second Creek War if you want to read it. But what the Second Creek War is, it begins in 1836. It will last through 1837. The Creeks will move down to southern Georgia and North Florida, and in fact, the Creeks will merge the Second Seminole War, or the Second Creek War, with the Second Seminole War. So at the very tail end of the Second Seminole War in the early 1840s are mostly Creek Indians from Alabama fighting that war. Okay, so it's also a very interesting thing. What the Creek War does is it gives Andrew Jackson the excuse he needed to actually forcibly remove Creek Indians. Remember, up to this point, there had been no chains, no shackles. It had been all coercion. Everything up to this point had been coercion. And so now what you do is you have the army come in, round up those who are participated in the war, shackle them, march them in basically manacles, right? So you're marching 90 miles from Fort Mitchell to Fort Gibson with your hands shackled, your legs shackled, and you're chained to a whole group of 300 other prisoners. You're marched 90 miles to Montgomery. You're put on steamboats. I should have by the way, here's Menawa. Menawa helps the federal government fight the Creek Indians. Here's Neamothla. He is one of the leaders of the Second Creek War, okay? And here you have the map. So Fort Mitchell, and from Tuskegee, they go down the Alabama River. They go out, they hit a storm, probably a hurricane. This is August. And they hit New Orleans. They go up, and they go mostly by water here. They would have gone the entire way by water, except for the fact that the Arkansas River was too low. They get up here to Rock Row, and they begin marching west. What happens is, and this is kind of funny stuff here, they're camped at Rock Row for 3 weeks. The government says, okay, we're going to give you a chance to take your shackles off, right? And so they're there for 3 weeks. The shackles are put in barrels, brought up on the steamboat, put on shore. In the middle of the night, Creek Indians see it. They roll the barrels into the river. They sink. They're never heard from again, right? Again, small acts of resistance along the way. And then they go. A second group goes. I don't think I have the second map. It's the same exact route there, okay? This Second Creek War in Alabama lasts for about 3 months before the theater of operations moves to southern Georgia and North Florida. And Jackson, again, now says, I want every single Creek Indian gone. Even those who aided the federal government in stopping the Creeks during the First Creek War. So Menawa, who led his people, risked their lives to fight other Creeks to stop the war, he's now got to go. Apathlilaholo, who is the most powerful headman in the Creek Nation during the removal era, he also leads his army of Tuckabachis with the aid of the federal government to stop the combatants in the Second Creek War. He also has to leave, okay? Now, this is not pure removal. This is what I call relocation, because the Creeks are being coerced west. They go more or less on their own recognizance. They don't really have a choice, but they're not shackled. And the government basically tells them, look, we can't force you west, but you got to go west, right? So it's kind of one of these weird things, right? By this time, the Creeks are so broken, most of their people are starving. Things are so bad that they've just more or less just given up. And they said, okay, fine, we got to go. We either die here or we try to start a new life in the West, okay? 5 camps are established. So Apathlilaholo's was established here at Tallahassee. There's one at Wetumpka. There's 2 in Chambers County. There's 2 up here in Talladega, okay? About 16,000 Creeks in these 5 camps. And on the day designated in early September, they all begin marching up. They're staggered so that there's provisions along the road. They get up here, they bottleneck here at Memphis. They take steamboats, some of them around the swamp, some go through the swamp, and they go. Now, when I was in high school, I had the image of Indian removal being U.S. Army soldiers with bayonets and rifles basically forcing Creeks to go, right? And they're trudging through the snow, and it's miserable. And this was miserable. But in fact, the Creeks held an enormous amount of power during these relocations. Even though they were more or less forced to go, they so outnumbered the military agents who were conducting them that if they decided they didn't want to march on a specific day, they just wouldn't march. And the federal agents, the military personnel, had absolutely no way of getting them to move. Menawa absolutely refuses to travel when it's too cold for him to go. Just doesn't do it. And all his people stop. Some of them take their stuff out of wagons. Some of them refuse to get on steamboats, right? So when it comes to Creek relocation, rather than seeing the image of Creeks being forced at the end of a bayonet, think of it more as military agents pleading with the Creeks to march that day. Please march. And some of them just say, I'm so disgusted with this whole operation because nothing's going right. Nothing's going right at all. Okay? They leave in September of 1836. They get there in December of 1836. Okay? Now, do you need a question and answer? 5 more minutes? Okay, perfect. The Creeks, when I say it was kind of a negotiation, what I mean was this. The Creeks didn't just say, we're going to go west. Apocalahola and Menawa didn't just say, we're going to go west. We want concessions. Okay? So some of the concessions they demanded, they got money, $2,000 Apocalahola got for basically compelling his people to go. The federal government wanted people to help them move, to fight the Seminoles. Okay, the goal of the federal government, right? After all this decade of just of punishing the Creeks and taking their land, they asked them, "Will you help us fight the Seminoles during the Second Seminole War?" Some Creeks say yes, but they demand a lot of money to do it. They're paid very, very well. In part of the concession for the some Creek warriors, about 700 go, for fighting in the Second Seminole War, is that their family members get to stay in Alabama until their tour of duty is over. And this is Detachment 6. I said there were 5 during relocation. This is the 6th. They stay behind, family members do, while their warriors go down and fight in Florida. Okay? But while they're here, waiting in these camps, militia from Alabama and Georgia come in and terrorize the Creeks. They kill a 90-year-old guy by bashing his head in with the end of a musket rifle. They try to rape a 15-year-old girl. They steal women's earrings by simply cutting off the ear rather than, just things are so terrible that the government moves them down to Mobile Point, aka Fort Morgan. So they come down here on steamboats down there, and they go down here to Mobile Point for a while, okay? And then they wait. The warriors were supposed to be back by February of 1837. The government keeps them in Florida till October of 1837, right? So now it's too late to plant crops for the winter once they get there. They finally do. They go across here. By the way, there's disease at Mobile Point. They have to move the camp to Pass Christian. Yellow fever, probably about 180 die of disease while waiting down in the Gulf. In October, they go up the Mississippi River on 6 steamboats. One of those is the steamboat Monmouth, which many of you may have heard. This, in the middle of the night, collides with another steamboat on the Mississippi River right near Baton Rouge. 300 Creek Indians die. The reason so many died is because it was at night, and a lot of them were below deck sleeping. Okay, so they couldn't get out as the hull detached and sank. They march up, and they finally reach Fort Gibson at the tail end of 1837. To show you that this was ethnic cleansing and the federal government wanted every single Creek Indian out of the East, they even went into the Cherokee Nation to try to round up Creek Indians who had fled to the Cherokees in the 1820s and 1830s. Okay? They capture them, they march them to Chattanooga, they go down to Gunter's Landing. Again, some Creek Indians, there's a storm here on the Tennessee River, some flee. They lost 76 because in the middle of the night as the flatboat hits the shore, they run off, they escape, right? So again, constant resistance at every point. And they go entirely by water, right? They can't march because the Creeks are just going to escape. And then finally, they go into Mississippi and try to round up the Creeks who had fled to the Chickasaws, okay? They leave Mississippi, they go up to Memphis, and they march west. So the Creeks that are in the the Chickasaw Nation, the Creeks that are in the Detachment 6, they arrive at about the same time, the last 2 days of December 1837. Okay? Now, one final thing, there are still Creek Indians in Alabama. There are small groups of Creek Indians in Alabama. We don't know what their status is. There's a good evidence that they were slaves. They had been enslaved by whites to work plantations. They weren't free to leave. But in the 1840s, they begin saying, I want to go to Oklahoma. I miss my family. I don't want to be enslaved here. And so in the 1840s, between 1841 and 48, you have these detachments of about, maybe 60 Creek Indians who will go to Indian Territory to be reunited. And I call these the reunification immigration, simply for this reason. They're reuniting with their families. They don't want to leave the land of their ancestors, but they miss their families. They miss their clans, and so they go west. All right? And that's all I have for removal. I hope I didn't go over. I was given an hour, but thank you so much.
All right, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Dr. Hapman, for being here. My microphone's not very loud, but if you would please raise your hand if you have a question, and either myself or Mary Beth will pass the microphone to you to make sure that everybody can hear. We're in this room and the other room, so make sure everybody can hear our questions. Mary Beth,
Why didn't one of the first ones, when you said there was nothing going on in the southern part of Arkansas, why didn't they just some of them stay there?
Nothing going on in the southern part of Arkansas?
Well, you said they crossed into there. One of your first points was that there was no that Arkansas was mostly, you said, mostly deserted. Why?
Oh, there were Indians. Yeah, mostly. Why didn't they just stay there? Because that was part of the United States. So Arkansas. Yeah, Arkansas became a territory in 1824, 25, and then So no, at this point they want them out of the United States. So at this point, Indian Territory is unorganized territory. Yeah, they couldn't stay in Arkansas because that was a future state.
When you refer to Creek, are you referring? Is that a particular tribe? Say, like around here was Muskogee.
Yeah.
Right? But when you talk about the Creek, is that a combination of several other tribes?
Yeah. The Muskogee is a language group. The Creeks were a multi-ethnic group of people that lived in Alabama, North Florida, and Georgia. And they spoke Muskogean language, they spoke Hitchitian, they spoke Yuchi, and they welcomed people from, there were Natchez who were Creeks, there were Shawnees who had been in the Creek Nation. So early on it was a confederation of sort of towns, not all ethnically similar, and some didn't speak the same language, but the Creeks were very welcoming of outsiders, and this is what made the Creeks very powerful and very strong. The Seminoles were Creek Indians who broke away in the 17 and 1800s. So, yeah, the Creeks were a multi-ethnic, multilingual nation.
There was a question over there. Sorry, I passed it.
I've been to Oklahoma, and one part of Oklahoma, down in Tuscaloosa, Oklahoma, which is the southeast corner, they had a lot of Creek Indians and also other Indians that was there, and there's a lot of history in that area. Then I went on up, but seems like down in that corner there's more history now than in other places in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I've never been down there, so I can't speak on that. But yeah, it's when you go to Oklahoma, I've been to Oklahoma a number of times. I mean, there's a Wetumpka, Oklahoma, right? You see a lot of Creek Indian names. There's a Coweta, and so it's in a lot of ways it's sad because they're that they all used to be in Alabama, so that's our legacy now in Oklahoma. They're and if you look at it's interesting. If you look at a license plate of Oklahoma, it'll say Native America. That's their theme, and there's an Indian symbol there. And so, they're capitalizing on the fact that they have all these Indian groups, which is in a lot of ways sad because, Alabama had all the 5 major southeastern Indian nations called Alabama home at one time. And, now we have the Porch Creeks, but they're all gone because of, stuff that happened 180 years ago.
After the removal in Georgia, the state held a series of lotteries to distribute the Indian land. One of my ancestors came south from Maryland to participate, got lucky on the 3rd try, therefore here we are. Did anything like that happen in Alabama?
They had auctions, public auctions. I'm familiar with the lottery in Georgia. I'm not familiar with how Alabama. I mean, I don't know if they had a lottery. I've never come across anything that said they had a lottery. I do know that they had plenty of public auctions. They would have auctions in Jacksonville. They'd have auctions in Montgomery, and they would announce these in newspapers, and you would come and bid on land.
When you talk about the Trail of Tears, is that what we're talking about here?
The Trail of Tears when we think of the Trail of Tears, yes, in a general sense. The Trail of Tears typically refers to the Cherokee. However, interestingly enough, the Choctaw is the Indian group that actually coined the term Trail of Tears. So Trail of Tears is a Choctaw term, somehow co-opted by the Cherokees, and it's stuck more or less. And I don't think any scholar really knows how the Cherokees got a hold of it. But yeah, it's the same stuff. So the stuff that's happening to the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Seminoles, it's all part of that sort of Trail of Tears era.
How long did they live in this region in Alabama?
Eons.
I brought pecans that grow in my yard, and I live not too far from holy ground. And I wonder
Oh, I mean, it depends on what period, but they had corn, beans, squash, watermelons. They had everything you can imagine. Livestock, at least during the removal era, they had anything white people were growing, the Creeks were growing it first.
Yes, I just wondered, how many different Indian groups were forced to go to Oklahoma?
Oh, I couldn't even count. I mean, lots, a lot. I mean, tons. In the north, in the south, you had the 5 big ones, but you also had in the north, Potawatomis and Saguenahs and Ojibways, and just a lot of different ones ended up in Oklahoma.
How about the other end of her question? Who was allowed to stay? Was anybody allowed to stay, or was this just everybody?
What, stay in the east?
The Indian group. Was there any Indian group that was deemed okay to stay at Alabama during this time, or did everybody go?
No. The answer to your question is no. No Indians were deemed okay to stay, but some did stay. The Porch Creek stayed because they were largely down near Mobile, and nobody really knew they were Indian. They had intermarried into white families so much they didn't really live like whites, and they were largely forgotten about. And some of their ancestors had participated in the First Creek War, and under the first article of the Treaty of Fort Jackson, they were allowed a land grant if they were friends of the United States. And even before removal, but especially during and after removal, once the Indians are starting to be forced west, they said, oh, we better petition for that land. I don't want to be moved. So they continued to petition. And then it took until 1984 or something until they got federally recognized. Some Cherokees cut a deal with the federal government, and they got to stay to the eastern band of Cherokees. There's Miccosukees and Seminoles in Florida too. So some got to cut a deal, but again, the government didn't go in and say, "Oh, you're free to stay." A lot of times they had to be very, very savvy in how they were able to stay.
All right, we have time for one last question. Our friend in the black shirt right there, Phil.
Do you know anything about the Chato? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
No.
My ancestors were in the Mobile area, and they were hidden by a general in the army, and somewhere along Foul River. But we don't really know what tribe that was. If it was the Porch.
Craig, do you know that?
The Appalachians were in there.
No, I don't know. Sorry.
All right, that was our last question. Everybody, thank you so much for coming, and thanks again to our speaker for coming all the way.
Thank you so much.